In today's episode, each of these grooves are assembled slightly differently to ensure that your drums pop. But inside this template, each track is also unique in its effects and device choices. There's plenty to learn in this episode and even some bonus tips towards the end. So don't skip and let's dive into it. Okay, so prior to this episode, I've already created the lo-fi groove template and the garage groove template for you guys. This episode will be no different in the fact that I'll be highlighting the MIDI arrangement choices and the devices that are used on those tracks. But if you're in a rush to start creating your own music, you can download the blank MIDI template from the Patreon link below, and you can start populating your own drum sounds. So I've got 5 tracks at the top of the screen here, and then some bonus stuff that we're going to come to. Each of these tracks are named, and I'm going to start off with kind of the sounds that I used, then the MIDI arrangement, and then any device choices that I have in the track. And I'll try to follow that narrative for each of the grooves. Now, each rack is going to be set out fairly similar. I'm going to have the kick here and the snare here. And then I'm normally going to have our hi-hats or our shakers on F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp. So throughout this template, you'll see my kick, snare, and perks in similar positions, and that will just keep it easy for everybody that downloads it or is trying to recreate it. The first drum groove is called the builder. This is kind of your basic tech house pattern. I'm just starting things off with a kick and a snare. I'm at the BPM of 126, but it doesn't matter too much for your grooves. Here's our kick and snare pattern, that snare sounding a little bit more like a kind of crunchy clap. I like to build things up with the shakers next. Notice the velocities here. These shakers are a little bit quieter than the shakers that fall with the kick. And notice that the kicks that land with the snare are a little bit quieter than those kicks that land alone. That's going to make sure that there's some dynamic and some humanization to our grooves. That's going to be the theme for today as well. So from here, you might want to start building in some shaker sounds. I separate my shakers into dark and light shakers, meaning closer to the mic and further away from the mic. Something I've done within this template, which obviously you don't have to do if you download it from the Patreon, but if you're building this from scratch, I'd advise panning these shakers. Just add in a little bit of sizzle to the top end of your track before dropping into the full body of your kit. Again, 2 velocities used with that ride cymbal. And that ride cymbal is just sidechained a little bit, as you can see here. As we move forward, I'm calling this groove Barry from the CBD. This is that kind of Barry Can't Swim, Ross from Friends, Chaos in the CBD, lo-fi house kind of groove template. For this particular drum groove, we've only got 2 kicks and we're using a 909 sound. This is called like an on-beat, off-beat pattern. The first kick lands on the on-beat and the second on the off. Then we're going to add our snares. But the brilliance of this kit is in all the subtleties. You'll notice here that I've got some extra snares that I've just warped from the main snare sample. To do this, I'll copy and paste that main snare sound to the left and to the right. And from here, I'll adjust maybe the gain, warp the sample by beats, change the mode, bring the envelope down, maybe even transpose the drum so we get different sounding samples. So on the left-hand side, we have something like this. Here's our main snare, a lot more full, and on the right, something very short where we're cutting off any of that transient sound. We just have the tail. Back to our MIDI pattern, we've also got more subtleties by adding little one-shot samples of a brush on a snare drum. We can also add subtle tambourine hits. And almost like a flamenco-esque hi-hat pattern. And then just to keep things grounded, we've got a shaker right at the end. You'll notice that this kit is a little bit more distorted than our last kit, and that's because we've got a little bit of glue compression and then my low-fire device. If you're not familiar, the low-fire device is something that I created for the Patreon family to replicate the effects of the SP404. So that's taking this groove from something that's clean to something that's a little bit more bit crushed, low passed, and distorted. Therefore, lo-fi. Let's play it with our sound. From here, we move to a groove that I call poly-type. Let's see if you can guess why I've called it that. So with this groove, I've got almost like a polyrhythmic-esque or a polymeter kick drum going. So we've got the snare landing on every other quarter note. I've also got two alternative snare sounds that are adding a little bit more movement to this kit. And then a verb snare. A verb snare at the end is just a snare drum that I've washed out with reverb to add a big dynamic splash at the end of the loop. And then you can see here at the top, using 4 different velocities, which I loop over and over and over again, we've got this kind of 16th beat hi-hat. Now, the interesting thing about the 16th note hi-hat is that I'm using an auto filter with the LFO to give it that dynamic feel. So not only does it have movement from that velocity adjustment, it's also got an adjustment from a brighter sound to a darker sound with the auto filter. To do this, you just tie an LFO on the down setting at a rate of half a bar to the frequency of the filter. It's a really easy trick, but just adds a little bit more movement. You're probably familiar with the channel sponsor by now. Explosion. DistroKid. I don't know if I'll have time to edit the explosion, but they now have an app. This came at such a perfect time for me. This app is so straightforward. Not only can I check my analytics of how my music is performing, but I can also check my DistroKid bank, which is such a guilt-free way of seeing if I can afford a coffee today. With this app, I can even upload my tracks and the metadata from it. And I often use it for creating and fetching the hyperfollow tools. It's super easy to integrate within your social media posts, no more copying and pasting from the website. There's over 1 million of us that use DistroKid to upload our music to over 200 platforms. And if you want to join in, make sure you use the link in the description below, as you'll get 7% off your first year. Let's get back to it. There's some really exciting stuff coming. Don't go anywhere. Moving swiftly on, this is called Vacancy. The cool thing about this Vacancy groove is that I've also included like a halftime shuffle pattern. There's only one element that changes with the MIDI groove to give it this effect, but it's a lovely, tense audio illusion. So with this pattern, we've got a pretty simple kick and snare pattern. So you can see that we've got our main snare pattern that firstly plays ahead of the downbeat and then on the downbeat. We've looped it over twice because we've got an extra little snare at the end of the bar. And we've got this ghost note snare here too. I warped that second snare in the same way that I showed you the Barry from CBD snare. Just copy and paste the main snare sound, and then you can warp the beat mode, dynamic, or the tuning of that sound. After this, I'm going to add some hats and some snap sounds. That snap is awfully subtle, but just adds a little crack to the second snare. And then we've got our shaker pattern. So you might have noticed that with this particular pattern, I'm adding a swing 16th groove. So what you do is from the groove pool, you just pull that sound down. You can search them up in the groove pool, and I'm using Swing Logic 16th 69. That's the particular pattern. There's a whole bunch of Swing Logic 16ths, and I've chose the last pattern. Now with the halftime shuffle pattern, the only thing that I'm doing is changing that swing 16th groove to a swing 8th note groove. It's a great way to build tension in your track through rhythm without having to do anything strenuous or time consuming. Remember, when all else fails, Old Faithful is the kit you need. Now don't go anywhere, because with this kit, there's some secrets going on inside. Obviously, you have your standard 4 to the floor pattern, 2 velocities once again, and I'm using 2 snare samples to just really beef up the snare sound. First of all, we've got this like reverb scent, almost like pop sound, and then we've got our main beefy snare. Don't worry, if you download the template, I've already sent that snare drum to the reverb. You haven't got to set up any sends or returns. I'm just using the medium dark plate with a pretty strict piece of EQ there. Let's go back to our MIDI arrangement. We've also got that offbeat hi-hat. Of course, we have that boots and cats fill. And our side snares. And a little clave pattern. We've also got this little hi-hat at the top here, which is just going to add a little bit of movement in your kit. You can see that I'm using 4 velocities here as a little kind of drum roll. You're going to hear that pattern time and time again from people like Fred Again to Peggy Goo to Tiesto. It is used throughout house, always has been and probably always will be. You'll notice that things look a little bit different with this drum rack as opposed to the previous drum racks we've looked at, and that's because we have our chains open. The reason we've got our chain group open is it allows us to see the choke groups, and from snare 2 to the hi-hat, which is the open hi-hat sound, I'm making sure I choke that sound. It means anytime that this snare is played, that hi-hat is turned off. It makes things super, super tight. Make sure that there's no overlap between your main downbeat snare and that open whoosh sound of the hat. So the little details that are going to make this kit sound really tight. On top of things, with this group, I'm EQing my hats so that they all sit nice and breathy together. The other thing to note about details is if we open up this kit, and I've done this with all the other kit sounds, if you download the template at the Patreon, you can check this out for yourself. But just as an example, I'm also panning my perk sounds. This creates some separation from the kick and snare, and it makes anything else sound nice and wide. So these sounds sit a little bit left, a little bit right, far left and far right, and then your kick and snare patterns sit nice and centrally. Now I asked you guys to stick around for a reason, because we also had some bonus material. Now that content comes in the form of a break layer. A break layer is a little track that I create out of drum breaks. I manipulate the loops and normally add some OTT, overdrive, maybe a little bit of redux. And you can see here that I've added the EQ8 and the limiter 2. So we go from something that's quite a clean loop to something like this. Now adding that to your drum layer can really spice up the arrangement. It just sits beneath your drums, but adds all of these ghostly rhythms. Let's check it out with the Old Faithful. And Barry from CPD. I do different things with like clave patterns. Let's do it with our final builder track. Each of these work really well, so what you can do is right click all of these options, create follow action, and when you highlight them all, you can set the follow action to play next or to play randomly. The rule that I've set up is each of these patterns will play one after the other after one bar. Can be a great way to spice up your groove, so don't forget about the break layer. Thanks so much for sticking this video out. Let me know what you learned and what you want to learn in future videos. I want to quickly shout out you guys for getting us to this 30K milestone. If you're coming back often but you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please do consider it. It's one of the best ways to support a growing channel, and it will always ensure that I make better and better content for you guys. Do remember that I've got other episodes around this subject of groove templates. If you like this one, I'd recommend checking out my UK garage episode, but everything is available to download in template form at the Patreon. Thank you so much once again, and I'll see you guys next time.